I'm part of a partnership, and I set up the partnership with Tom Lloyd about 14 years ago for a very simple reason, that actually I want my ideas challenged, a little bit like Michael was saying. I don't want to feel too confident that what I'm thinking is right. And in a way, for us, design is it's a very interesting tool to study human behaviour. In a way, that's what we try and do in the practice. So ultimately, we design for manufacture. And I think one of the things that we try and handle is this growing knowledge that sort of buzzes around our minds. But then how do we filter that knowledge, and how do we reduce complexity in the products that we design? And I think a little bit, as has been explained earlier, I do believe that design is about simplifying the world around us and improving it. We're very lucky that in the 14 years we've been practicing as a consultancy, we've worked with a myriad of companies in very many different sectors. Part of the reason for that is to keep ourselves fresh and keep this questioning inside us. So if you look at the top right, that's a chair I'm going to talk about that was a very interesting project with an American company, Steelcase. Huge company, in fact, down to projects for probably the smallest company we've ever met, which is a British company, and there's a wooden chair. So there's a big variation. We also do product design, and we're very interested in the notion of innovation and where innovation actually comes from. Sometimes it can be in really small little moves, other times they're big moves. The top image there, which probably you can't see at the back, is a screening system we developed using a new material called expanded polypropylene, which is basically polypropylene beads that are put in a tool and they're kind of expanded with steam. The bottom right-hand corner is a new showering valve that can be turned off from the outside so you don't get a wet arm. And in the top right-hand corner is a hearing aid we did for the Royal National Institute of the Deaf, and it was looking at removing stigma. Why did they have to look like these strange little things that look like they're growing in your ear? We also work in transport, and very luckily we were invited by Virgin to design their upper-class seats 6 years ago. And it was a kind of pivotal moment for us because we realized how innovation could change an entire industry. And in fact, it changed the industry not just in business class travel, but also in economy classes as well. But I think perhaps one of the most demanding and interesting sectors is those people that don't choose to purchase design, but come in to interact with it on a daily basis without knowing it. So really that's design in the public realm. And at the moment we're just designing all the street furniture for this incredible historic city in England called Bath, and a wayfinding system and mapping system. We also do sort of future gazing. We're one of 3 consultancies who design for Transport for London, which is a very complex organisation. And at the bottom there is one of our future concepts for the stations. But I think more importantly for us, when we're designing, it's this notion of what is a brief? How do you get to a brief? And in fact, over the last 14 years, our nightmare is to be given a brief by a client and say, go away and design this, because this client has something like that, and we'd like you to design something similar, but a little bit better. And it's a kind of nightmare, because how do you do that? And anyway, maybe they weren't right in the first place. So what we're interested in doing is finding this thing, which is in a way an enlightened process. A client who can ask the question, what could it be? What should it be? Steelcase is the biggest furniture manufacturer in the world, with a $14 billion turnover. And amazingly, the design director came to us and asked us to do a project. And I said to him, why don't you do more projects with external designers? And the simple answer was this: we won't make anything unless we can identify a need. And in this incredibly choppy economic climate, that's a very refreshing point of view. Now, this is a chair for the collaborative worker. Nowadays, with smartphones, etc., the knowledge worker meets short periods of time in shared environments. So a task chair with all that adjustability doesn't make much sense. What you actually want is a product that intuitively responds to the user. We were very lucky to be involved in this project from the ground up, and we came up with this sort of metaphor that it should be like a second skin. You don't really know it's there, you don't have to do anything to it, it just follows you. So we went through this very extensive ergonomic development. In fact, the project was almost entirely to do with sensorial and physical ergonomics. We didn't really think about aesthetics until the very final stages. Final product is cradle-to-cradle certified, which of course is very important. And I'm just going to show you this little movement, MoveMe. Basically, when you're in meetings, there's this thing called little movements. In order to maintain comfort and concentration, you want to let the body move around. Most chairs are static and fixed. They feel comfortable for the first 2 or 3 minutes. So when somebody says to you, "Oh yes, I'm really comfortable," they'll generally move 10 seconds later, which proves that they weren't. In fact, comfort is more about not knowing that you're comfortable. So you can see here the extreme movements with this very finely fluted, co-molded back. And it's a kind of miracle that it works. In fact, it still gives me pleasure looking at this image now. But what was more amazing was that if we'd looked at what was currently on the market and said, how can we improve these things, we would have never come up with this innovation. And it was only through this enlightened process that we could do that. The second project is for an Austrian company, and it's called Parks. And basically, again, looking at the collaborative worker, what was happening is these people were meeting in shared environments, and we were trying to shoehorn, or clients were trying to shoehorn existing product into that market. What became clear to us is that if we looked at that existing product, we wouldn't learn much, other than it was wrong. So we went back and we started looking at basically human behavior and asking simple questions. What did it mean to be public or private? How did you achieve those things? What was work, rest and play? What was planned? What was unplanned? And we started looking at basically how people interact in everyday life to understand the nuances. Obviously the project relied on looking very closely at what actually happens in the office as well. So whether it was analog or digital, the space saving requirements, how many people you could fit into the office. But at the same time, we were looking at cultural connections. This is a Taguna in Mali, where people meet to discuss things. And the net result was basically we defined a completely new product typology and architecture for the office. This company didn't do anything like this before we presented it, and 2 years later it's responsible for a big proportion of their turnover. So it's an amazing sort of story about how innovation, true innovation, and an enlightened brief can actually deliver a real product. Now moving on to the work that we've done with the Design Council. And this is one of the projects, Design for Patient Dignity. And I just want you to look at the shape of the screen here. It's built kind of like a sail. It's a very lightweight screen. And then you have this patient transfer chair here. I'm going to move on to the next slide quickly to explain how they work. When you sit in a normal quartering chair, it's a kind of Victorian, strange bit of metalwork which sits you in an uncomfortable position. You're upright, you're stooped forwards, you feel frail, vulnerable, it's very undignified. And you're not stable. If you pass out or want to sleep, you can't. Alternatively, you're wheeled around in a bed on your back, looking at the ceiling. You can't see the nurse or the orderly that's wheeling you around. You're not even going forwards, maybe you're going backwards, and you don't know where you're going. It's very alienating. Additionally, when you arrive at the place where you're actually going to be seen by a doctor or nurse, or you're waiting, you're put in a cubicle, generally with curtains. You can't see out. Often the curtains are left open and people can see directly in other patients. So if you look at the top image here, we defined these screens to act on basically a sort of chevron type layout, which means that it's very easy to get the chair in. You can see the carers, but you don't have a direct sight line across the passage to another patient who might be going through pain or having surgery, etc. The chair itself puts you in a reclined position, so if you want to fall asleep or you need to, you can. So moving on to the second project which we did with them, which was Design Bugs Out, which is, as David said, essentially to reduce the transfer of these nasty bugs, C. difficile and MRSA. And they're not just nasty, they kill people. And essentially the problem is cleaning. If we can clean the hospitals, we can get rid of these bugs because penicillin doesn't work anymore. This is a lovely quote, information is not knowledge. And I think for us it's absolutely vital when you connect this quote to this project. This is the bottom line, to excuse the pun. When you're sitting on a commode, this was one of two projects that we designed, a patient chair and a commode. When you're sitting on a commode, if you are unwell and you have diarrhea, the aerosol will travel 2.4 meters all around you, which is quite a sobering thought. So the red line shows how far the aerosol will get. So cleaning is obviously paramount. But what is different about working in healthcare to perhaps designing a product for a company is that when that product's sold, product's over, the life is over. But with healthcare, you have stakeholders that have a continued invested interest in the project, the product. In fact, you could say that they're the users. You've got the patients, you've got the nurses, the maintenance and the orderlies, all these people use the product on a daily basis. All of them have a different axe to grind when they're talking about what the product should actually do. As a designer, how do you deal with that complexity? Well, through the Design Council, an expert panel was set up which contained a lot of these stakeholders. So when we were going through the tools for any design brief, looking at the benchmarking, going on hospital visits, doing our user mapping, we could filter that back through the expert panel. Now obviously, a lot of designers will only get to do benchmarking because they won't have that. And what can you learn from this? Well, all we could learn looking at these was that the basic commodes look like strange Victorian contraptions. And really, they're just portering chairs with a kind of toilet seat stuck on the top. They're almost impossible to clean. You don't even know how to take them apart, and I'm a product designer. Also, theory and practice. When you actually get into the hospitals and you talk to the orderlies and the nurses, you find out what should be happening isn't happening. How do you deal with that information? You know, do you disregard it, or is it actually very useful? Is it because the product's wrong, or is it because the system is wrong? How do you challenge that, question it? And in terms of our observations, they seem startlingly obvious. These things were taking about 20 minutes to clean. Why was that? Why were they so complicated? Why couldn't it look like a simple stacking chair that you could just wipe down with one sweep of the hand? Now, in order to make sure that our assumptions were right, we had to talk to all the stakeholders very carefully. So we did a very careful process of user mapping, where we interrogated every single part of the life cycle of this product. And we went back to the expert panel. And essentially what we did was we broke the product down and did a full feature analysis, and we really asked critical questions about the product. We actually disregarded everything we had on the market and asked them about every single feature. Did we really need it? So the expert panel we used as a kind of portal of dissemination, a way in which we could filter the information, interrogate stuff, get people talking to each other that otherwise wouldn't have talked before. If we're talking to them in isolation, we'll obviously have a relatively limited conversation, but getting them together, we can get everything on the table. And when you look at the commode in the bottom right-hand corner, the existing one, you can see these little fixtures and fasteners underneath, which are screwed down. It's kind of insane when you find out that they're actually cleaning them with toothbrushes and pipe cleaners. It's kind of unbelievable. So our ambition was to reduce the cleaning process down to something very intuitive. Basically your hand and a sponge. If you can't get your fingers in, you can't clean it. It's not going to work. So from that point, the concept became very clear, and we worked very simply in the studio in terms of if we can describe the concept in a simple sketch on the back of an envelope, we've probably got an idea worth talking about. So these were a couple of the early sketches. We have a single seat, a little bit like a plastic stacking chair for a reason. Gives good comfort and supports the back. It's also one-piece moulding. Into that, a top-loading pan sits, which provides an airtight seal so that that aerosol, the 2.4 meters, just won't happen. Now, the storage image where the commodes were stacked up in the storage room underneath all that chaos, we decided to make everything stackable so it would take up less space in the hospital, but of course also in terms of shipping, environmental costs, etc., etc. The design process itself was very standard. We built mock-ups, we showed them to the expert panel, we went through an engineering process with the company. But what was interesting and additional to this is that we went and showed the product in its prototype form to showcase hospitals, 18 in fact, and they had an estimated 15,000 visitors which paid visit. These comments were received back into the Design Council, filtered through the expert panel back to us, so we went through a second stage of development, out of which we now have 2 products which are on the market which will radically reduce the amount of C. difficile and MRSA transfer, hopefully saving lives. The first is the patient chair, which is a fully injection molded plastic chair. And you probably all recognize what a patient chair is now. It's a wooden chair with bits of upholstery on. Impossible to clean. The cushions are held on by magnets that are molded into the plastic. So if somebody does soil the chair, you simply pull off the cushions and wipe down the chair and then replace the cushions. Second product is the commode. One-piece plastic shell with no fixtures or fittings on it at all, meaning you can wipe it down. It stacks, good for transport and storage, sits onto a stainless steel frame that won't scratch, which also stacks and nests for storage and transport. And then this one-piece shell simply sits onto the frame with no additional fasteners or fixings, no screws or anything. Nothing can come off the frame. The lid sits in to allow you to sit in it for comfortable portering, and then the feet rest slide out rather than lift up for less able-bodied users. Side access is maintained through one arm being able to stay up. And then when it's used as a commode, we have a top-loading pan, either in plastic or pulp, depending on the hospital and the system, which sits in from the top. It has a lid on, so obviously contain any spillage when it's removed away. Now I think what's interesting about this is this really does mark a paradigm shift in how commode design has taken place, and the net result is really dramatic. And it can only come about through basically design with an enlightened design process. Thank you.